social issues that Brian is involved with. So I was like, wow, I'm excited that we're here together today, but you are here. So why, if you rarely accept speaking invitations, why are you here?
Well, I think that one of the most important things I can do is help the next generation entrepreneurs, and this is what this room really is. You have, I think, 1,000 entrepreneurs from around the world, and I spoke at the GES last year. I'm a page member, so I spoke in Nairobi, and I ultimately believe that one of the best ways to make a huge impact on the world is to inspire people to actually change that world. And so who are the people that are changing that world? Well, I think entrepreneurs are some of those people, and I also believe, and I said this when I was in Nairobi last year, is, a lot of us are from Silicon Valley and we operate companies here in San Francisco or the Bay Area. But if a customer is using a product, I don't think they care where the founder is from. I think they care that that product is amazing. And so what does that mean? I think what that means is that the next generation of entrepreneurs can come from anywhere. They're not necessarily going to come from San Francisco because ideas don't just originate here. They come from truly anywhere. And so I told them that I thought when I was in Nairobi that the next great entrepreneurs could come certainly from Africa, and they certainly could come from really any country around the world. And so this is so core to my mission, not just to help entrepreneurs, but to help entrepreneurs all over the world, because that's where ideas are from. And most of our business, 75% of our business, is outside of the United States.
Wow, that's amazing. Oh, it'd be great to see. That's awesome. Maybe a show of hands from the audience. How many of you are not from here?
Basically, yeah.
That's so awesome. That's so great.
There you go.
Okay, so Airbnb is about 8 years old.
Yes.
And tell us a little bit about, some of these folks may be in the early years of their journey.
Right.
Was it always easy? Did you always think it was going to be the huge success that it is today?
It was really not easy for many years. When we first came up with the concept, I told somebody I really admired about it, and he looks at me, he pauses, he gives me this look, he said, Brian? And I said, yes. And he said, I hope that's not the only idea you're working on.
Serial idea.
Yes, exactly. And so this idea literally did not work for a long time. In fact, we launched, and 3 people used it. So we worked, we started rebuilding the website, we launched again, and then 2 people used it. And I was actually one of those 2 people. So that wasn't really good. So then we launched a 3rd time, and we had 80 people use it for the Democratic National Convention in 2008. We had 1 weekend of business. The following weekend, we had nobody using it again. And I realized if only there were political conferences, political conventions every week, we'd have a business. Within a year and a half of you doing Airbnb, I remember totally running out of money. I used to have a binder that kids used to put baseball cards in, and Joe and I used to put credit cards in them. And we just literally were funding company with credit cards. We ended up meeting investors. We met 10 or so angel investors. We were trying to sell 10% of the company for about $150,000.
Oh my gosh, that kills me.
And
I wish I had a time machine. I would write you a check right now.
We couldn't even get a meeting. And so eventually, we just continued to fund the company ourselves. We literally made collectible breakfast cereal to fund the company. We called ourselves serial entrepreneurs. And we literally went door by door meeting our customers, and that's how it started taking off.
What? Because there are a lot of people in this room who I'm sure have questions
Right.
about whether they should keep going. How do I know my idea is good enough to keep going? There's faith,
Right.
which is sometimes well-placed faith, and sometimes misplaced faith.
Right.
How did you know to keep going?
Well, the thing is that whether you have a good idea or a bad idea, I can almost guarantee it's not going to work for a really long period of time, and it's always going to look like a bad idea. And in fact, a lot of times the great ideas seem like really bad ideas. I mean, when we told people about Airbnb, they were like, are you crazy? You think strangers are going to sleep in other strangers' homes? That's never going to happen. And I remember somebody telling me, he said, don't worry about people stealing your idea, because if it's any good, everyone will dismiss it. And I think that's probably true. How did we know, and how did we keep going? I think one thing we did is we tried to solve our own problem. I mean, the way the company started was I and my roommate could not afford to pay rent. A design conference was coming to San Francisco. All the hotels were sold out. We had this idea. Let's just turn our house into a bed and breakfast for the design conference. I didn't have any beds. My roommate had 3 air beds. We pulled them out and called it the Air Bed and Breakfast. We ended up making enough money to pay rent. Many years later, people asked, why did you keep going? And I said, because I remembered back to that very first weekend. And I remembered how amazing those experiences were. I got to pay rent, but more importantly, we made friends. And I said, if people knew could experience what I experienced that first weekend, this would be an idea that would spread around the world. And so I think it's not about blind faith, but it's about if you've solved your own problem or seen people be deeply connected to your product. I mean, the best piece of advice I ever got was from our first investor, Paul Graham. He said, it's better to have 100 people love you than a million people that sort of like you. And so if you can find 100 people that love your product, and if they're, as long as there's more people like them in the world, then you will have an idea that they'll spread around the world. But if you can't get a few people to absolutely love your product, then you do have a problem.
So that's, I mean, knowing when you started out that you did not have a lot of traction, I'm an investor, right? I meet with seed stage investors all the time. What questions should I have asked you, if I hadn't had the fortune of meeting you back then, what questions should I have asked you, or what should I have seen? What should investors have seen in you and your team and the idea that most of them didn't get for the first 3 years?
Well, the problem with funding a lot of entrepreneurs is you're kind of looking for pattern recognition. Oh, this reminds me of Facebook or Snapchat or like some company. And the issue is that like Facebook probably didn't look anything like any other company, right? We didn't look like any other company. I went to art school. A lot of people didn't want to invest in us because I wasn't an engineer. We were looking for traction. Our graphs weren't going up and to the right. I think you should look for two things. You should look for a great entrepreneur. And to know somebody's a great entrepreneur doesn't necessarily mean they've started a company before, because a lot of us, it was our first time. But you look in their background and say, what have you created in your past? Maybe it wasn't a company, but like, do you have this like creative resilience? And I think people didn't look past my immediate background. The second thing is, are people deeply passionate about what you're doing? Like, do customers love your product? I think it's more important to measure love than growth. If people absolutely love your product, they're going to tell other people and your product's going to grow. If an investor is waiting to see a graph up and to the right, they're probably already bidding with a whole bunch of other investors at a really high price. And, so I think it's actually maybe late by then.
All right. I'm going to use that in the future. I'll let you know how it goes. Now, you are in almost every country in the world?
I think we're in about all but 3 countries.
Wow, that's amazing. You have 1,000 employees.
Yeah.
You're $25 billion valuation or more, maybe.
Yeah.
Or more. And in setting up these new countries, you've traveled a lot, you've been on the road, you've seen a lot of things around. So there might be folks from other parts of the world who think like, God, sure, it was hard for you for a couple of years, but you're in Silicon Valley, all the money's here, this is kind of like the altar of entrepreneurship, it's so much harder out there. Like, what advice do you have for folks who may not be trying to start a company here in Silicon Valley, but are out there where there isn't as much money, there isn't as much support? And how does that blend with what you've observed from Airbnb?
My gut is this. I mean, I would just say this again, which is your customers do not care where you're from. They care that what you made, they want, and it's really great. They'll never know where we're from. So it's a pretty level playing field from a customer perspective. Now, it could be a little harder if you're not San Francisco to get going, but I can also tell you would say this as an investor, once a company does have traction, it doesn't matter where they're from. And so, I would
say, by the way, as an investor, so I raised a startup fund 4 years ago, and being a female, being a sole investor without a big team, when pretty much everyone else is male, I kind of have experienced, even though I'm from here, a similar thing, which is you have to find the handful of people who have faith and are willing to make a bet on things that you've said or your idea, because most people don't want to back people who don't look at like everyone else they've backed in the past.
I think I think it's really important, two thoughts. From an investor perspective, I think investors should remember that the next great entrepreneurs might not look anything like the last great entrepreneurs. They may not look or feel the same at all. They might not sound like that, and that's actually okay. Because many of the great entrepreneurs of the last generation were the first of their kind. They're often going to be, they may not be men, they may not be from the United States, and I think we need to be very open-minded about that and know that that's probably not going to be, the next generation is mostly not going to be from the United States because most customers are not from the United States. I think for entrepreneurs, it's true. I mean, most of our customers are not in the United States, so why would you assume all the companies will continue to be started here? I think that what a lot of entrepreneurs are missing are maybe communities, like startup communities with robust other entrepreneurs, people that can help them, and talent, and hubs. But the thing is, once a company gets going, it creates a community around it. And I think that's really important. I just would not be afraid of failure or rejection. I mean, as you probably imagine, being an entrepreneur is incredibly humbling because a lot of people say no to you. I was convinced that I wasn't talented enough in the first couple of years at Airbnb because I said, why isn't this growing? If we were better, this thing would be growing faster. And it turns out that that is the long road of an entrepreneur, that you face a numerous amount of rejections and you're climbing the hill for a very long period of time. And then one day, it kind of turns. And then all of a sudden, you're like trying to just hold on for dear life.
And did it give you a little extra motivation that people rejected you?
It definitely does. And I try not to rub it in the investors' faces, but I do want to, or customers, or press, or anyone. I think, though, that it's just important to remember that before somebody was successful, they were probably like barely getting by in an apartment trying to run their company with press that didn't want to talk to them, investors that didn't want to take meetings from them, and customers that weren't interested in what they were selling.
It's amazing. Any last, congratulations, by the way, on everything that you've built and the global community that you've built. It's really incredible. Very Any last words of advice, especially maybe as a founder, CEO? I mean, when you started out, like you said, you didn't have a lot of work experience. You scaled to be at the helm of a very large company. How have you scaled yourself? And what advice would you give to the folks out there who want to scale themselves?
You know, I think I've reflected on like what's the most important thing I've learned, and it's super hard to give like a single lesson. And so probably the highest leverage thing I'd say is the most important thing I've learned how to do is to learn quickly. Like, I'm learning how to learn, because there's not one lesson. And fortunately, it's not even 1,000 lessons. There's literally like 10,000 or 100,000 decisions that I've had to make, and many of them are very small. And they're literally like every hour for the last 8 years. I think learning how to learn is incredibly important. And what are some ways to learn very quickly? Well, there's a couple basic things I could say. The first thing is if you had to learn everything about a subject and you had 1 week, what would you do? You'd probably like read 10 or 20 different sources. Well, as an entrepreneur, you can't spend a week learning about one thing. You might have to learn about 5 things in that week. So now what are you going to do? You don't have time to read 10 or 20 sources about 5 different topics in a week. So what you learn is a shorthand. What's a shorthand? Well, what you can do is, instead of spending 10 hours learning about a subject, spend most of those hours learning who the source of that subject is, and then go directly to that source. And that is a shorthand. And so for me, that source were mentors, people around me. And there's a saying, you're the average of the people you surround yourself with, and you have to be willing to reach out to them. Another thing you need to do, I think, as an entrepreneur is be a little bit shameless. It's easy to like fear rejection, to feel like people don't want to help you. The one thing I can tell you is when I reach out to entrepreneurs and other people, they help me. And I ask what I can do in return. And most of them have said, I want you to help other people when they're in the same position. I think you'll find that if you reach out to people, whether they're in your community or other communities, most of the people are willing to help. And I think that's what maybe is unique about Silicon Valley. And I know this is happening around the world. Silicon Valley is not necessarily a zero-sum game. Most people are willing to take a meeting and help you. And I would be a little bit shameless about who can help you.
Totally. I totally agree with that advice. Well, great advice, Brian. Thank you so much.